people who believed, and they're all zealous for the Torah. So in the first century, there wasn't this idea that the law was done away with. The Jews were still faithful to Torah. They were still believing in Yeshua and faithful to Torah. There was no contradiction. And Paul went with it. He wasn't just doing it just to try to trick the Jews or trying to placate them. He himself said, I'm a Jew, I'm a Pharisee of Pharisees. I've never done anything against the Torah or the customs of our people. So that was the early foundation. So what happened here? Let's get in our time machine and travel to Messianic Judaism of the 4th century. A lot of times when you hear church history taught, they'll say that the destruction of the temple happened in 70 AD, and that was pretty much the end of the Jewish movement. After that, it was a Gentile movement, and the church became Gentile. I would attest that's not really the case, that the separation didn't happen at 70 AD. It went on much longer than that, and I'll give you some quotes that will help to show that. This is a quote from Jerome, the so-called church father Jerome, to another church father named Augustine, and he refers to the Nazarenes are those who accept Messiah in that such a way that they do not cease to keep the Old Testament. So here's his letter from Church Father Jerome to Church Father Augustine. He said, they do not call themselves Christians. He's talking about these Nazarenes, these Jewish believers. They do not call themselves Christians, but Nazarenes. They remain wholly Jewish and nothing else. For they use not only the New Testament, but also the Old like the Jews. They live according to the preaching of the law, as among the Jews, and they have a good mastery of the Hebrew language. That's pretty significant. So 400 years after Yeshua, possibly 5, we still have what I call Messianic Jews that believe in Yeshua, still practicing Torah, still living as Jews. So the separation doesn't come as early as what Christianity would like us to believe. It doesn't fit the narrative so well. Generally, Christianity likes to teach that God was finished with the Jewish people, replaced them with the church, and to prove that he was finished with the Jewish people, he destroyed the temple. To once and for all do away with that old religion and prove that the new religion is Christianity. Well, that didn't actually happen as clean and clear as Christianity likes to teach. Let's see here. And this is a letter from another church father known as Epiphanes. He says, the entire law and the prophets and what is called the scriptures are read in Hebrew by them, speaking of these Nazarenes. Only in this respect they differ from Jews and Christians. With the Jews, they do not agree because of their belief in, he says, Christ or Yeshua. And with the Christians, because they are trained in the law, in circumcision, the Shabbat, and other things. So he's saying there's this group, they don't fully live like Jews, and they don't fully live like Christians. They're like Jews because they keep the Torah, but they believe in Yeshua. They're like Christians, but they keep the Torah. So they're like Christians and they believe in Yeshua, but they keep the Torah, circumcision. So this is 400 or 500 years after Yeshua, and there still exists this group of what I call Messianic Jews, and probably Messianic Gentiles along with them. So how did we get the parting of the ways? When and where did that happen? I'm glad you asked. Constantine, but even a little after him. Constantine gets the ball rolling, without a doubt. Constantine, 325 after Yeshua, has a Council of Nicaea. He doesn't invite any of the Jewish leadership to it. He only invites the Christians to it. They make a decision about when to celebrate Easter or they reject Passover and they celebrate Easter, and they take it away from the Jewish context of keeping it when the Jewish people keep it at Passover time, and they decide to do it after the vernal equinox, the spring equal daylight day, which is in time with the rest of the pagans that celebrate around that time as well. That's a very simplified version of what happened there at Nicaea. Certainly, I could spend a whole session talking about Constantine. He was a general. He conquered the other generals. He wanted to reunite the Roman Empire under his leadership. And the most unifying thing in the Roman Empire at that point in time was Christianity. So in my opinion, he hijacks Christianity for his own purposes and rebuilds the Roman Empire as the Holy Roman Catholic Empire at that point in time. It becomes the Holy Roman Church. But what really, his thing there isn't so much about Jews, it's about non-Jews not following Jewish things. So yes, he starts the ball rolling and was hard on, he definitely helped to work towards the separation of the ways. But where Jews really get pinched is in the Second Council of Nicaea in 1787. And it was in that council that it was the first council to formally ban Jewish-believing Jews to live as Jews. And Jews were required to renounce all their ties to Judaism. So for the Jewish people, the wedge really came, it began at 325 under Constantine, but it became solidified at 787. So remember, we're talking 700-800 years after Yeshua. There's still Jews that are keeping Jewish traditions, and actually a lot of non-Jews that are attracted to it. So much so that the church fathers put up a big fight because they're afraid they're going to lose the Jewish converts, the Gentile converts, or the Gentile Christians. And so they come up with laws. Here's a map of Constantinople, where the Second Council of Nicaea was held. And they came up with a set of laws from the council there of if Jewish people wanted to follow Yeshua and be a Christian, this is what they had to do. So here is what really parted the ways and made it impossible for a Jewish person to be a Christian. This is what a Jewish person had to recite. I renounce all customs, rites, legalisms, unleavened breads, and sacrifices of lambs of the Hebrews, and all the other feasts of the Hebrews, sacrifices, prayers, aspirations, purifications, sanctifications, and propitiations, and fasts, new moons and Sabbaths, and superstitions, and hymns and chants, and observations and observances of the synagogues, and the food and drink of the Hebrews. In one word, I renounce everything Jewish, every rite, law, and custom. And afterwards, if I shall wish to deny and return to the Jewish superstition, or shall be found eating with the Jews, or feasting with them, or secretly conversing and condemning the Christian religion instead of openly that looks like a typing error, openly confronting them and condemning their vain faith, then let the trembling of Gehazi cleave to me, as well as the legal punishments to which I acknowledge myself liable, and may I be anathema in the world to come, and may my soul be sent down with Satan and all the devils. Church of Constantinople, profession of faith. That's quite a confession. So if you want to, so all superstition, don't want anything to do with the rights of the Jews, no Sabbath, don't eat with them. And if I'm even found hanging out with other Jews, and I'm not trying to convince them about the truth of Christianity, I'm liable, and I should be anathema in this world and the world to come. If I'm cursed, I can't be saved ever, and I should be sent down with Satan and the devils. Wow. Yeah, they've spelled it out pretty clear. Let's see. The servant of Elijah who got the leprosy. It's a pronunciation that I believe from the Septuagint. May I get leprosy, basically. Yeah. So that obviously you can see that drove the wedge. I mean that was the final parting of the ways that were Christianity made it impossible to be Jewish and a Christian. Sorry? 1787. And it lasted all the way up into the 17th century, this confession of faith of the Church of Constantinople. So throughout, from basically 800 years after Yeshua all the way up until the 1800s, if you were Jewish and wanted to put your faith in Yeshua, you had to renounce anything Jewish. In complete contradiction to Deuteronomy 13. So you can see why throughout the Middle Ages, Jewish people said, I'd rather be killed than to become a Christian, because to become a Christian is to deny the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Christianity had put such a divide that it was impossible to stay true to the covenant of Adonai and to be Jewish. So parting of the ways for Gentiles kind of came back there in 325, where this counterfeit, or that's a little strong, this alternative version came forward of Constantine. But the parting of the ways for non-Jews really became at 800, where the Jews were forbidden to be Jews and follow Jesus. Yes?
Was there always, though, a small remnant of followers or believers in Yeshua that kept their Jewish ways that maybe went below the radar?
So the record of them kind of stops around this time. There were the Ebionites that were kind of underground and listed as heretics. So yes, I would say yes. There's always a remnant, but it's hard to see solid links in that chain. Unfortunately, we lose a lot of the record of followers after that. Certainly after that, anybody that does try to attach themselves to any kind of Torah observance or anything like that, whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish, from there on out, they're all heretics. Yeah, the modern day, there's a denomination called the Nazarenes. I'm not aware that they have any historic connection to the first century Nazarenes, but they were a restoral type movement, and I think there was a Sabbath day movement in the Nazarene denomination. There's certainly been Gentile movements. There's been Gentile movements throughout church history that have kept the Sabbath, without a doubt. That's happened. It's hard to find a Jewish group that's kept it throughout church history, but there has been certainly non-Jews that have various movements. That's an interesting study in itself of how there's always been this remnant. It's from history, it's not clear if there were Jews involved in those movements or not. We don't have a good written record of it, but we have a written record of non-Jews that were in it, and possibly so there was Jews in there as well. We do know there was Jews in the church during this time, Jews that had renounced everything and kind of became anti-Jewish, which I would get with this sort of declaration. You would get the sense that Jesus was anti-Jewish. I mean, that's what appears. I mean, I renounce any of the superstitions and the Shabbats and the dietary laws. I renounce all that stuff as... They came up with another Jesus, unfortunately. That was an anti-Torah, anti-Jewish Jesus, anti-Semitic Jesus of all things. I mean, in essence, that's what was propagated here. So you can see why it was difficult for the last, really, 2,000 years, give or take, for Jewish people to come to faith, because it meant really denying the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But good news is God's always had a remnant, and actually, we do see revivals breaking out. It's beyond probably the scope of this lecture, but there are that little remnant like you're talking about. But there is a revival in Messianic Judaism in the 16th century. So let's see here. Let me bring that out for you. And it happens in an interesting place called Herrnhut, Germany in 1722. There's a wealthy landowner, and you can see this is actually Herrnhut modern day, present day. Wealthy German noble by the name of Count von Zinzendorf. And there's a group that comes out to him at 1720. Let's see. Martin Luther was, 1592? He posted his theses on the door. So the Protestant Reformation had been around for about 200 years. And the Protestants that were really believing in the Bible, the radical reformers, were beginning to be persecuted by the Protestants and the Catholics. And so this group of persecuted Christians goes to Count von Zinzendorf, and he protects them because he has private property. They were known as the Moravians. And he protects them, gives them, allows them to live on his property. And they have revival. There's an outpouring of the Spirit there. They have tongues and interpretation, and really a rebirth of Pentecost there. And they launch a 100-year, 24-hour-a-day prayer movement comes out of the Moravians. And they are radical in their faith. they're still around. They've lost their radicalness. They've become more of a social group now, unfortunately. But when they were first initiated, they were radical. They would sell themselves into slavery in order to preach the gospel, especially in the Canary Islands, to the slaves, and a really amazing group. But in that group, there was Jews, and Count von Zinzendorf was one of the first to recognize you need to live as Jews. And so he actually starts a Jewish community in his kingdom there, if you would, and encourages Jews to live as Jews. So we see the first kind of revival of the Messianic movement there in 1722. Amazing thing. He encouraged Jews to stay Jewish, to keep kosher and keep the feast. And his movement lasts all the way up until 1896, when Theodor Herzl came up with the first Zionist conferences. So God protected that Jewish community all the way up until just about the foundation of the state of Israel. And so it's really interesting. They begin to plant even Messianic congregations, Jewish congregations in London and in various cities, and encourage Jews to marry Jews and to live as Jews. Radical concept. So we get kind of the rebirth of the Messianic movement there. There isn't an unbroken chain from them to us, but we see God working, doing a work there in the 1700s. As the Moravians begin to phase out, Zionism comes on the scene, and we get this revival in other parts of the world. And one of the key players in that is Rabbi Joseph Rabinowitz. He lives 1837 through 1899. He grew up in a Hasidic home, and by age 6, he had already memorized the whole book of Song of Songs. By age 8, he had memorized entire chapters of the Talmud. He was brilliant, gifted prodigy. He was an expert in Kabbalah, and his brother-in-law gave him a New Testament. And he began reading the New Testament and said, I've got to decide about Yeshua. So he goes to Jerusalem to go and seek God and to find out if Yeshua is the Messiah, and he gets a revelation in Jerusalem that Yeshua is the Messiah, and determines that Jews need to accept Yeshua. He goes back to Ukraine and established the first Messianic synagogue of the time, and not Ukraine, sorry, Kishinev, Russia, in 1884, and he calls it the Synagogue of B'nai Israel, Synagogue of B'nai Israel and B'nai Brit Hadashah, so Synagogue of the Children of Israel and Children of the New Covenant. And neither Rabinowitz or synagogue were connected to Christianity or denomination, and the government of his area in Russia there legally designated them as a Messianic synagogue, a Messianic community, and a distinct Jewish sect. And Rabinowitz synagogue considered circumcision, the Sabbath, the feast, incumbent upon all Jews. They had a Torah scroll and used traditional Siddur of Messianic adaptations and referred to Jesus as Yeshua. He was a forerunner of the Messianic movement. About the same time as the Civil War was happening in the USA, just to give you a kind of a time frame where he's at. Another luminary of this time, Rabbi Itzhak Lichtenstein. He comes from Hungary. Became a rabbi at age 19, and a regular traditional rabbi. He served his district for 40 years. And early in his career, a fellow Jewish teacher gives him a German copy of the New Testament. And as he's thumbing through it, he comes across the name of Jesus. He throws the book because he's furious. He's like, why are you trying to trick me with this book? He's furious that this kind of, this guy doesn't have pure intentions. He's clearly trying to proselytize him. So he's furious. He throws the book. It goes behind the bookcases there in his room. 30 years later, they have a pogrom in his town. Pogrom is where the Russians go in and they beat the Jewish people and mess up their town and sometimes killed. But they'd have Christian kind of raids on Jewish towns in order to terrorize them. And they mess up his schoolroom. And so he's packing up his schoolroom, packing up his books, and he comes across this New Testament that he'd thrown there 30 years in the past. He reads it, gets radically saved, puts his faith in Yeshua, and began teaching his traditional synagogue about Yeshua. And began writing documents, tracts to help convince fellow Jews about Yeshua. He gets fierce opposition. They try to poison him, try to kill him, and they try to depose him out of his congregation. But his congregation loves him so much that they refuse to let the district rabbi depose him. So he keeps his congregation, and even though it cost him personally in his own persecution, he remains steadfast to Yeshua. And faces significant persecution. They send people to spy on him. They follow him around wherever he goes. He gets attacked on the streets, gets beat up. They bribed a barber to cut his beard off because they said he's not a Jew anymore. He's accepted Jesus. So he gets insulted. But many influential Jews come to visit him, and he ends up having a pretty significant work there in Hungary. These are just a few. I don't have the time to go through all the luminaries, but I want to give you just a snapshot of some of these pioneers that helped pave the Messianic movement. The next one I'd like to introduce you to is Rabbi Moshe Emmanuel ben Meir, 1905 to 1978, getting closer to our time. Rabbi Moshe Meir was born and grew up in the old city of Jerusalem. He was an Orthodox Jewish family. In the time that the Ottoman Empire was controlling Jerusalem. He was sent to an orphanage in World War I and spent time there, spent time as a teenager in the British Army in the Middle East. He found a New Testament in the street as a young man in the army, and he begins to read it and comes to faith in Yeshua. It's amazing how the Word of God works. So all three of these guys came to faith because of reading the New Testament. But the interesting thing with Meir, he doesn't give up his Judaism. He stays an ultra-Orthodox Jew and lives according to Jewish halakha. He planted a congregation in Jerusalem, but all the Christian churches rejected him. And in fact, he said the worst persecution he got wasn't from the Orthodox or the religious Jews in Israel. The worst persecution he got from the churches. They're the ones that preach against him. And they would write letters to the people that were supporting him and say, don't support him, he's a heretic, he's following the Torah. And they would come against him. Interesting story on him. He tried to work with the organized church in Jerusalem. He was going into the church, he had his kippah on, and one of the elders at the door, or deacons at the door, stopped him, threw his kippah on the ground, and says, the kippah has no place in this church. If you want to worship here, you got to take your kippah off. So I can't take my kippah off. It's my sign that I'm under the authority of God. So they said, well, you're not welcome here then. So he went outside. Him and his wife were kicked out of the church because they looked like Jews. Amazing. You think a ministry in Jerusalem that was trying to reach Jews would try to be a little more hospitable to Jews, but no, that was their criteria. You can't come in here looking like a Jew if you're going to be a Christian. So he decided there is no safe place in churches for us. He started a synagogue in Jerusalem, and that was a synagogue that my wife and I attended the whole time we lived in Jerusalem. He passed on the authority to Rabbi Joseph Shulam, but it was Joseph Shulam helped him start it, and he's passed now of blessed memory. But he ran his synagogue. It still runs as a traditional Jewish synagogue. They use a traditional Jewish prayer book, have a traditional scroll. It's wonderful. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful service. Beautiful congregation, and they have a great outreach to the Orthodox community because they've had such a long history of actually living according to Judaism in Jerusalem. When now I am digressing, but I can't help but tell a good story. Rabbi Joseph Shulam, who was his successor, the Orthodox community was persecuting him and the congregation and sending out letters to the community, don't go to this, they're heretics. And he went down to the those who were attacking him. He said, leave me alone. We are an Orthodox synagogue. We have as much right to be here as you do. And they said, well, no, you're a Christian. He said, yeah, I believe in Yeshua, but we read the Torah scroll. We read from the Siddur, the same Siddur you read from. We keep the Shabbat, we keep the feast, we keep kosher. Our synagogue is kosher. Why are you persecuting us? It's a great story, actually. Since I'm digressing, I'll go all the way back. He got saved as a high school student. He was teaching there was a missionary in Jerusalem, and he was in school, public high school, with his missionary's sons. He taught these missionaries' sons how to smoke, And the missionary, the father, came and visited his house and said to his dad, your son taught my sons how to smoke. I want you to punish him. And in the end, that missionary led him to faith in Yeshua. But the initial contact was because he taught the missionary's sons how to smoke. Got saved, and his parents immediately kicked him out of the house. He had to flee to America because they were coming after him. He fled to America and finished up high school in America, went to a seminary, Bible college, seminary in America, went back to Jerusalem, and went and told he was Joseph Shulam, the successor of Rabbi Ben Meir, grew up secular. So he goes back to Jerusalem after being trained in Christianity in America, and was telling all his friends about Jesus. And they said, well, that's great for you. But the problem is you accepted Jesus because you don't know your own religion. You grew up secular. You don't know anything about Judaism. So of course you bought into that lie of Christianity. You don't know anything about your religion. He said, okay, you're right. I don't know anything about my religion. But I believe that even if I knew my religion, I'd still hold on to Yeshua. They said, well, we'll see about that. Why don't you try a regular yeshiva? Go to a traditional yeshiva, and then we'll see what you think about Yeshua after you get a traditional training. So he went to yeshiva. They said, you can't come to yeshiva if you believe in Yeshua. He said, but I want to learn about my traditions. They said, okay, on one tradition, you can come, but you got to leave Yeshua on the shelf. Once you're finished with yeshiva, you can decide about what you're going to do about Yeshua. So he went through yeshiva, top of his class, learned the Talmud, learned all the Jewishness, all the Orthodox traditions, and was ready for his day of smika, ordination. And they said, well, you've been top of the class. We're ready to ordain you. But one question. You've passed everything. You're perfectly fine. You should be the Rosh Yeshiva, head of the yeshiva. But one question. What have you decided to do with Yeshua? He said, well, I did like you said. I put him on the shelf all the time I was studying here. I didn't bother to tell anyone about him. I just left him on the shelf like you said. They said, well, how about now? He said, well, after going through all your training and understanding my religion, top of my class, I'm that much more in love with Yeshua. I took him off the shelf, I dusted him off, and I'm that much more a follower of Yeshua. And they said, well, that's a pity, because you could have been one of the top rabbis in Jerusalem, but because you accept Yeshua, we can't ordain you. He said, that's fine, I've been ordained by Yeshua, but thank you for the education. And so when they're persecuting him later, he went down to the headquarters and said, stop persecuting me and my congregation. We're Orthodox Jews. We keep the Torah. We keep the Shabbat. We read the Siddur. We keep the feast and festivals. Leave us alone. I've been through yeshiva. We're Orthodox Jews. So they said, well, we don't believe that. You're Christians. You're trying to trick Jews into being Christians. He said, come to my synagogue. So they came. They visited the service. They said, wow, you're Orthodox Jews. We don't know about that Yeshua business, but you guys are definitely Orthodox. They said, well, you're probably putting it on. So they came and they visited 3 weeks in a row. They said, okay, you're definitely Orthodox Jews. Okay, we can live with that. We'll stop the persecution. But we want to be able to speak in your synagogue. He said, that's great. Come, speak. We'll do a yeshiva. So they came and they were teaching the yeshiva. Third week, the rabbi that was teaching gets all angry, upset, stops his lecture and says, Yeshua is not the Messiah. Joseph Shulam stood up and said, I invited you to my synagogue to teach yeshiva, not to preach against Yeshua. You're out. So they kicked him out, and so they've made their peace that we agree to disagree, but the persecution stopped. He's the only rabbi that I know, a Messianic rabbi I know in Israel, that is esteemed by the Jewish community because he lives as a Jew. All right, moving right along. That was definitely a rabbi trail, but it's pretty good. Sorry? Nativia. Yeah. Wonderful. Charlene's been there. It's great. It's a beautiful congregation. They have their own building and really beautiful to visit. It's beautiful to worship there. Great story. Thank you, Charlene. So it's interesting. The rabbi there, Joseph Shulam's still alive. He now has a young rabbi that's beginning to take over his place. Yehuda Bachana, we were very close to their family. But he has a philosophy that it's hard to pastor over 250 people. So he says, we refuse to build a bigger building, we refuse to add on. If it gets over 250 people, I don't know the people, and I can't pastor them. So they never go over 250. And when all the tourists comes, it's hard to find a seat. But he said, that's it. That's the number of seats we got. We're not going to add on. We're not going to build on. We need to start another congregation if we can't fit them all. Wrote the Complete Jewish Bible. He's of blessed memory now. He's passed, but his wife still attends. If you've read the Complete Jewish Bible, that was his home congregation. So yeah, wonderful experience we had living in the land, being there. I mean, it was tremendous. I mean, it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. So it's possible to be Jewish and believe in Yeshua, but according to the church, it's not possible. The Catholic Church still hasn't quite repented of that. Protestantism hasn't really fully repented of that. We still get some of those questions as we were searching for churches. People were, very curious about what we are and what we do, and the question of why can't you just be regular Christians? What are you guys holding on to all that Jewish stuff for? So the idea still travels. It's still in people's minds. It's still in Christianity's mind. It hasn't gone away. But that's one of the reasons God raised us up, to declare that, hey, you can be Jewish, you can be non-Jewish, and you can believe in the Messiah, and you can keep Torah. These things aren't contradictory to each other. In fact, they actually work pretty good together.
So, 1,400 years, it was illegal.
Illegal. Yeah. If you were, and that's where the expulsion from Spain and the Inquisition, that if you found a Jewish person practicing Judaism and believing in Jesus, they were burned at the stake. And I mean, it's incredible to think that we had this as part of our history. So it was more than, Christianity likes to say, it happened at 70 AD when God destroyed the temple. God proved that he was done with the Jewish people and done with the Torah and started something new called Christianity in the church. We saw from this history that that wasn't the case. It didn't happen at 70 AD. Yes, the temple was destroyed then, but Jewish practice and belief in Messiah continued at least 500 years. It wasn't until 700, almost 800 years after Yeshua that they actually made laws against it. And I could show you a lot of, there's a preacher called John Chrysostom. He writes of the Jews and their lies. But there was a lot of non-Jews attracted to the Jewish stuff because he's trying to convince Gentiles not to go to synagogues because there's such an attraction of non-Jews to Jewish things that he writes against Jewish practice because he's losing his congregation to the Jews. So that's unfortunately it's a sad history, but Baruch Hashem, he's raised us up for such a time as this to be a light and to say no, the Torah is not bad, it's not evil, it's not contradictory to Yeshua. So there's a brief history of the first 1,700 years. Next week I'll cover the modern-day Messianic movement that starts largely in 1967 and brings us up to today. And to the Lutheran Church we go.
Full circle, isn't it?
It's amazing. I'm going to do a message on it before. To the Lutheran building we go. They're great at building buildings. Not so great on theology sometimes, but in Luther's defense, if there is a defense, early on he felt like the reason Jews couldn't see Messiah is because of all the corruption in the church. And he's right, largely. But he felt like if there could be a pure form of Christianity, the Jews would see it and be convinced about the truth of Messiah and get saved in mass. Well, unfortunately that didn't happen. There was 2,000 years of history there, and the Jewish people were still, the church still wasn't keeping Torah, so the Jews didn't convert in mass. He was frustrated. I think he wrote, one of his early works was Jesus was a Jew, trying to convince the Jewish people about the Jewishness of Jesus. After getting rejected by the Jewish community, he gets upset, and then he writes of the Jews and their lives and calls for their synagogues to be burned, their holy books to be burned, and persecution. And ultimately Hitler grabs his work and says, I'm only finishing the work that Luther started, that the Jewish people shouldn't have a place to live. I don't know if that's the case. I haven't found any documentation. I would hope he did, because he certainly wrote pretty rough stuff. So there you go. Any other questions? I think we're close to out of time, but